And so I was quite happy on that ship. She just sailed back to Britain, and we found our way up through the Irish Channel. And the moment we got to the Irish Channel, it started raining, and we made our way up to the River Clyde, and swung around the buoy there, just near Gourock and Greenock, the part of the river that they called the tail of the bank. And there were a lot of ships anchored there at that time. And I remember that quite a severe storm blew up while we were there, and the winds were so strong that although we were at anchorage, the ships had to steam ahead so that they didn't drag their anchors. And even at that stage, some of the ships were still dragging their anchors, even though they were working their engines against the storm. And one or two of us nearly collided against each other during the night. And the storm blew for a few days. The other thing I remember about being in the Clyde at that time was going ashore at a place called Greenock, which we used to say Greenock. And there were so many ships there, and so many sailors and Merchant Navy and Royal Navy going ashore, that if we could stay the night at all, we'd book bed and breakfast. And lots of people's homes, Scottish people about the place, had a spare room. They would take in some of the sailors and give them a bed for the night, and feed them in the morning, give them breakfast, and then you go back to your ship. After being so many weeks at sea and so many weeks lying on or living on a ship, we of course were glad to get off at any price. And so there's all these blokes milling about ashore, going into the pubs, having a booze up, and going to the dances, dancing with the local girls, and generally enjoying life in Scotland with the rain pouring down. And this one particular night, I'd been, I don't know where, to a dance at a pub or something, and trying to get back to the ship when I'd missed the last Liberty boat, so I had to stay ashore. And it was always wise to arrange a place to sleep as soon as you got ashore, because if you left it too late, everywhere was full up. So I tried lots of places and eventually went to the police station, and the policeman on duty there said, try these addresses. So away I go out into the rain again, and there's nowhere more miserable than Greenock when it's raining and cold, and it was getting into the winter at that time for the UK. And of course I plod round and knock on these doors, and they're all full up, and pretty desperate, not knowing what to do. I thought, well, at least I had shelter in the police station, I'll go back there and ask if they know of any other places. And the policeman said, oh, it's pretty hopeless, he said. Maybe one or two other places, but he said, if you like, he said, you could sleep in one of the cells. And I said, could I? Would that be all right? He said, yes. He said, I can give you a blanket, and you sleep in the cell, and that'll be okay. And he said, the only thing about it is I'll have to lock you in. So I said, okay, I don't mind that. It's about 1 o'clock in the morning, and I was quite wet. I'll be very grateful to sleep. He said, well, it's not very comfortable, it's a very hard bed, but he said, I'll get you a blanket. And of course I slept in the cell that night, and the policeman wakened me in the morning with a cup of tea. And of course I made my way back to the ship. But of course we got rid of all our troops, and there were just the naval boys who were crewing the boats, one or two naval officers, and myself, who was the only maintenance crew for the engines and for the craft, and the ship up anchored and steamed down the Clyde. And of course we were always interested to see where the ship was going, because there was so much secrecy in those days about ship movements that nobody was told what was happening. And so we go down the Clyde and down to an island called Arran, and we start turning around the island, and we sort of go into an inland waterway with land on either side, and we go for quite a few miles, and we see one or two towns on either side of this loch. And we were travelling up Loch Fyne, F-Y-N-E, and one of the blokes had got some news about where we were going. He said, "Oh, we're going up to Inverary. It's being turned into a combined operations base." And so that's where we went. We went up this loch, which sort of joined on the Clyde, and we went all the way up to Inverary. And of course we're hardly see, because the clouds were so low and it was raining and the clouds were almost down to sea level. It was quite a miserable looking place. And one of the chaps knew about Inverary a little bit. He said, "Well, at least there's a couple of pubs ashore. If we get a chance to get ashore, we'll be able to go and have a beer." So of course the weather fined up eventually, and we could see this little town, Scottish town in the Highlands of Scotland, with its white walls, whitewashed walls of the houses, grey slate roofs, and looking very picturesque in the sunshine. And the landing craft were lowered, and we were given shore leave, and we were able to go ashore. There were only two pubs. There was the Argyle Arms and the George Hotel. And it was about this time that we had one or two reinforcements. There were a couple of motor mechanics came aboard, and they said, "We've been allocated to the ship here," and they were older than I was, and they were a higher rank. And they said, "Well, we've just come into the Navy and we don't know anything about these boats or anything." They said, "The best thing you can do is you be our boss and tell us what we've got to do." So I fell into a routine of giving them any little jobs about the boats that needed doing, about the engines, or checking over various things, having a look at the propellers or the shafts or what happened to them. And occasionally there were quite a lot of troops ashore, although there were none on the ship, and occasionally we were sent to pick them up and land them on a beach further down the loch and give them a little bit of exercising. The troops would run up over the hills and disappear, and we'd go back to the ship, and they'd find their own way back to the camp usually. And of course there were dances ashore. We were able to go to a dance, and there was a cinema for the troops. There were thousands and thousands of troops of all nationalities, and the program eventually came about that these troops were being put through landing operations using the boats on the ships. We weren't the only ship there. A few other landing ships came up with their assault landing craft, and we were all used from time to time. So it was quite a busy little place, this tiny Scottish town. And the two chaps that came to stay with me, one was from the two motor mechanics, one was from Bolton in Lancashire, and the other one was from Scotland, from a place called Stonehaven on the east coast goes to Scotland, and John Kennedy was to Scotland, of course, and Dennis Miller was the bloke from Lancashire. And so we got on quite well. We had good fun together and went ashore together. And one night coming back, we'd been to the pub and had a beer or two, and we're coming back and to get the Liberty boat back to the ship. And we missed the first Liberty boat, which was about 8 or 9 o'clock. And so we had to wait for a later one. And it was quite a pleasant evening. And we sat on the end of the jetty at Inveraray, with our backs leaning against a boat, which was upturned, just a small rowing boat, I suppose. I don't think it was a sailing boat, just a small rowing boat, not much bigger than a dinghy. And we leaned our backs against this and had a cigarette together. And while we were talking, oh goodness knows what, the sound of the night was broken by the girls that were walking down the pier. We could hear feminine voices, and we had a little look. It was very dark, of course, pitch black, and we could just see 3 girls walking out along the jetty towards where we were. And of course, as far as they knew, there was nobody out there, I suppose. And as they arrived to the end of the jetty, we stood up and said hello and gave them a little bit of a fright, I think. And this was the first time I met your grandmother. She was one of the 3 girls. I'm not sure of the other 2, which she had several friends. And because there were so many troops that were in the area, some of the working girls from Glasgow, if they had relations or whatever in the town there, used to come up and stay the weekend and get to know the soldiers and the sailors that were in that area, just for the fun of it. There were thousands and thousands of men, and this tiny village with hardly any women. So, of course, Connie's mother, your grandmother's mother, or your great-grandmother, lived in this town of Inveraray. She'd been brought up there as a girl, and when all her family married and left her, and she'd lost her husband long ago, she moved back to Inveraray. And Connie used to come up and stay with her. Your grandmother, Connie, was working in Rolls-Royce. In Glasgow there was quite a large aero engine factory that were making the aero engines for the Spitfires and Hurricanes and all the fighter planes. And quite a large factory. And Connie worked in the payroll department. They made up all the pay every week or fortnight for the workers in this factory. And of course, with some of the girls from the factory, I think, and other friends that she had, she'd arrive in Inveraray over a weekend to stay with her mum, and she'd have 1 or 2 of her friends with her. They were looking for a bit of fun with the soldiers or the Navy boys. Anyway, we chatted to the girls, and we said, well, we've got an hour or so before the boat comes in, let's go for a walk. So the 3 sailors, or motor mechanics, and the 3 girls walked along the seafront, past the town, and out on the road that leads in from Glasgow to the town to what we used to call the Humpback Bridge. And we stood on the Humpback Bridge and talked, and I was just was with your grandmother, talking to her, and the other two fellows were talking to the other girl. And we walked back to get our boat and said cheerio. But before we'd done that, I'd loaned your grandmother a handkerchief